I'm Greg Dalton, and I've been hosting Climate One conversations here at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco for more than 12 years, since I went to the Arctic on a global warming expedition. When I'm on this stage, I usually have a live audience in front of me and guests sitting right beside me. Today, we're doing it the way you're probably going about much of your work and social life, on video. Keep an eye out on Twitter, Facebook, and our website, climateone.org, for future Climate One discussions on coronavirus, human behavior, economic disruption, and climate change. We're not going to be all COVID-19 all the time, but we're going to weave it into what's going on. You can also tune into our weekly podcast wherever you get your pods. Thanks for joining us. COVID-19 and carbon pollution are both invisible and deadly threats. Both are global. One is spreading fast in human timescale, and the other is happening quite slowly on a human timescale. One harms people directly when it enters your body. The other harms people and other beings indirectly when we spew it into the sky. On the program today, we're going to explore the human response to COVID-19 and carbon pollution. How are they similar and different? What does one inform us about the other? I'm delighted to welcome three guests joining us from the safety of their homes. Peter Atwater is an adjunct economics professor at the College of William and Mary. He studies confidence-driven decision-making and trends in financial markets in his Financial Insights newsletter. Susan Clayton is professor of psychology at the College of Wooster, where she also is chair of environmental studies. She co-authored the American Psychological Association report on psychology and global climate change. Robert H. Frank is professor of economics at Cornell University's Johnson Graduate School of Management. He's a former columnist for the New York Times and author of Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work. Welcome to Climate One. Thanks for joining us, all three of you.
Good to see you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Be here.
Well, Susan Clayton, you recently woke up in the middle of the night with a tickle in your throat. Tell us how you felt, what you did, and what you thought.
Well, I know what you're getting at, which is that my initial anxiety, I overreacted. I thought, oh no, I have the coronavirus. I'm doomed, essentially. And it took just a second or two for my rational mind to kick in and tell me that was very unlikely. But it's that instinctive reaction that I think explains a lot of the kind of reaction we see among other people as well.
And how does the reaction to this virus, which is invisible, how do you see that compared to this gas, carbon pollution, which is also invisible and deadly and harmful in a different way? How do you compare those two, our human responses?
Yeah, well, clearly we're responding a lot more strongly to the coronavirus than to climate change. And part of the reason for that is, as you said in your introductory remarks, I think disease is a lot more immediate, a lot more scary than the idea that we're gradually destroying or harming the atmosphere and the ecosystem. So we definitely respond to that idea that our personal health is compromised. But I also think it's important to recognize that both of these things, because they are invisible, people are kind of relying on, they need to have the situation interpreted for them. So there's a really big role for the social media, for political figures and other people who are prominent and visible to explain to them. In one case, we don't have a lot of people who are very prominent talking about how scary climate change is, but we do have a lot of people talking about how scary COVID-19 is.
And we'll get to the social media in a minute. Peter Atwater, you liken this moment where we have this looming threat, that you liken it to when Hurricane Katrina was barreling down on the Gulf Coast, and there's this big scary thing offshore. It's coming. We can kind of watch it coming our way. How do you compare that Katrina moment to what we've been experiencing with COVID-19?
So what you could see was that, particularly from an American perspective, when the virus was contained in China, that was the first narrative that went along with that. There you had an existential threat that was far, far away and really not a threat with the view that it was contained. And what I could watch and see was the narratives brought it closer and closer to us in terms of proximity. And one of the things about threats is that our anxiety rises exponentially as threats become closer and closer to us from a perception standpoint. And so you could see the level of anxiety turn to panic as it went from being afar and contained to being near us to now being among us.
Right. I mean, I was a reporter in China in the 1980s and studied China and I've heard of pandemics, but at no point when I read about Wuhan did I anticipate that it would come here and to have the impact. And I think maybe I'm ignorant of the science, and some people might feel that way about climate change. Robert Frank, how do you see the way individuals are responding to these distant threats and very different invisible threats?
Well, I think Susan hit it on the head with the distinction between what seems like a distant threat on the one hand. That's the way many people view the climate threat, and the virus threat, which is really quite immediate. I mean, you have 2 weeks from the time you're exposed to it to the moment you might be faced with a genuine threat to your life. And what we know is that people are just not very good at reckoning how to deal with threats that seem distant many years into the future. There's some interesting work by an economist at UCLA, Hal Hershfield. He shows people pictures of themselves that are digitally altered to simulate what they would look like at age 80 or so. And after having had a chance to study the image of yourself at age 80, people become much more future oriented in little experiments that he asks them to make choices between now and later. People are much more future oriented. So I think it's what Pigou called the faulty telescopic faculty. We can't look ahead and put adequate weight on the future. What's changed in recent years, fortunately, is that the extremity of weather events, the fires, the droughts, the floods, have persuaded many people that climate crisis is not a distant phenomenon at all. It's really upon us. And so I think many more people are willing to take seriously the fact that we need to take action to try to parry the threat that compared to 3 or 4 years ago, it's a much bigger change than I think I saw coming.
So there's important differences on time and proximity. You know, a gunshot somewhere in a city is one thing, but a gunshot on your block gets your attention a lot more dramatically. Susan, Clayton, what's about the importance of actually seeing? You know, we hear information, we read, but you know, we live in a very visual age, particularly video, social media. How important is it, you know, to see someone? I watched 60 Minutes, someone being, you know, carried into a hospital in one of those cocoons. Is like how important is seeing versus other ways of processing information?
Well, I think, you know, Robert hit the nail on the head when he talked about how some things seem very distant and other things begin to seem very close to us. And time scale is one of the things that can make them seem distant or not. And a visual display can also bring it home and make it much more personal. It's not the only way for people to feel that something is close, but it is something that tends to have an impact. We're a very visual species, and you know, even a little bit of visual information entering your field of vision will grab your attention. So when we see a striking image, it tends to have a major impact.
Journalist Shannon Osaka covers climate change for Grist. She recently wrote an article detailing how the spread of zoonotic animal-borne diseases like the coronavirus have been aided by a warming climate and the destruction of animals' natural habitat.
In the decade of the 1950s, about 30 new infectious diseases were reported. And in the 1980s, the number jumped to almost 100. And scientists think that a big part of this is based on how our relationship has changed with the natural world. Our encroachment on wildlife has just dramatically increased. We have deforested large portions of the planet. Our urbanization is impinging on habitats that we used to pretty much leave alone. And a lot of infectious diseases that we think about as being a big deal today, so that includes SARS, MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and now the coronavirus, they often originate from bats. And as we encroach on sort of wildlife and habitats, we see those bats basically coming more into contact with humans, more into contact with other wildlife that might contact humans. And all of that means that the possibility of a virus traveling from bats to humans goes way up. there was a study in 2017 about Ebola outbreaks, and Ebola has also been linked to bats. And this study found that areas of Central and West Africa, which had recently been deforested, had a higher incidence of Ebola outbreaks. And there's a lot of scientists who have been out there kind of sounding the alarm and saying, look, we know that when we are deforesting, when we're doing habitat destruction, but also warming temperatures causes animals to move from their traditional areas. And so that can mean animals coming more into contact with humans, and it can also mean animals coming into contact with other animals, and that can also cause other forms of spillover. What we're seeing now is really not the worst thing that could happen. The coronavirus is not extraordinarily fatal. And so a lot of the experts I talked to said, we should see this as kind of a shot over the bow. The natural world is kind of saying, hey, look, this is the kind of thing that can happen. And there is a possibility that future pandemics could be worse.
That was Grist magazine reporter Shannon Osaka. Peter Atwater, your reaction that things could be worse, and maybe there's some messages there about our relationship with nature.
Well, I think that, when confidence starts to fall, we naturally fall into that cycle of things being worse. We're looking for, conditions to deteriorate even further. It's something that, we're magnetized either to overconfidence or to underconfidence. And right now, I think there's in any number of ways, I'm seeing lots of not just reassessment of risk, but potentially an overassessment of risks.
Are you saying we're overreacting?
No, I'm just saying that with confidence being lower than it has been, we are prone to overreact to things that we view as threats.
Robert Frank, there's a kind of a backlash now saying, reopen America, we've gone too far. Do you think there's a reassessment of risk happening?
Well, we certainly know that there are some people among us who are not overreacting to the risk. I'm sure you, like the rest of us, saw those clips of the revelers in Florida last week. Why should I interrupt my long-planned trip for spring break just because there's a virus out there? I might get it, but so what? I'm young. I'm not going to suffer much from it. So I think there was a sort of a clear trail of people who were just not at all concerned, or not nearly as concerned as they ought to have been about the risk, if not to themselves, at least to other people that even they care about, never mind the people that we all care about. So I think, there's an upside to being too alarmed. There's a downside to being too alarmed. If you had to choose between those in the current moment, I'd say being too alarmed is probably the better choice.
Robert Frank, you wrote in The Atlantic recently about behavioral contagion. So tell us what that is and how it applies to the current coronavirus situation and then also potentially climate, behavioral contagion.
It's the term that behavioral scientists use for how ideas and behaviors can spread from one person to another, very much like a virus might spread in a population. There's some important similarities between how behaviors and ideas spread and how viruses spread, but there's some differences too. One difference is that visibility helps ideas and behaviors spread. So if your neighbor has a solar panel on his roof and it's in the front of the house where you can see it from where you sit, that's much more likely to stimulate you to consider an installation than if it were in the back where you couldn't see it. So visibility is a helpful thing in behavioral contagion, or at least it stimulates others to mimic what you do. If we see somebody close to us who's obviously sick, we try to give that person wide berth. We don't want to mimic the neighbor who's sick. We try to avoid that person. So that's a key difference. But other similarities are abundant. I mean, the idea that what's good for you as a person is often not good for us as a group is a deep similarity between the two cases. So if you think of the familiar stadium metaphor, I stand to see better because the people in front of me are standing. when we all stand, none of us sees any better than if everybody had remained comfortably seated. That's a collective action problem. It doesn't mean I'm irrational to have stood. I don't regret having stood. If I hadn't, I wouldn't see it all. But we need some way to restrain what we ourselves do individually to secure a better outcome for the collective, for us generally. And I think that's exactly the problem that we're up against with trying to contain a virus. What's expeditious for an individual to do is often just a horrible thing for the community if people do it.
Susan, Clayton, would a normal person standing up in a stadium, would they feel guilty about blocking anyone's view, or feel any sense of responsibility if they're partying on a beach in Florida when they kind of know it's not the right thing?
Well, I can only guess what the people on the beach in Florida were thinking, but I suspect no, because they looked around and everybody else was doing the same thing. So they were getting immediate support from their social context, even if, across the country, people were saying, "What are you doing?" And, that's one of the things about behavioral contagion. It's often literally the people who are physically closest to us are going to be most influential. Doesn't have to be just physical distance. It could be people who are closest to us in other ways. So as long as the people who are similar to us are acting in a particular way, we might not care at all what other people think about what we're doing.
Yeah, that we live in a tribal country where we're kind of divided in tribes. Robert Frank, you've cited studies about bullying and smoking in high school that has quite a profound effect. Tell us about those.
In line with what Susan just said, it's the actions of certain people that turn out to matter much more than those of others. And so in studies of social networks in high schools, the consistent finding is that if people at the central nodes in those networks model certain kinds of behaviors, that has vastly greater influence than if others do so. So if you see a central actor come out quite forcefully against bullying behavior in the high school, that has an enormous impact on peers. If peripheral actors make the same statement, a much smaller impact. And in the smoking case, just by accident, it turns out that in some schools, it's the cool kids who smoke. In other schools, it's the not so cool kids who happen to be the smokers. And people who have studied smoking rates in high school students after having left schools have found that even a dozen years later, you're more likely to become or remain a smoker if you attended a high school where it was the cool kids who smoked. If you were at a high school where the not so cool kids were the smokers, you're much less likely to smoke. So it matters enormously whose behavior you're exposed to. If it's an influential other, that has a much bigger effect. And that's why it's so very troubling to see influential leaders behaving in an irresponsible way. There's a huge impact of that.
Peter Atwater, there was the Tom Hanks moment for the coronavirus. That was certainly, someone who's widely beloved. Kind of tell us about that, the American symbol and what that meant.
Yeah, so I think you had with Tom Hanks, it was interesting. Within a half an hour, you had the report that he and his wife had been impacted by the virus, as well as the news from the NBA that the Utah Jazz had been infected. And I think those symbols are really powerful and important in terms of bringing that familiarity that Susan discussed very close to us. So suddenly, people felt that if Tom Hanks had it, if an NBA player had it, it was likely to impact me. And what you could then see was this cascading impact in terms of cancellations and closures. That to me was one of the major tipping points in this crisis, is that through that conveyance, these symbols, the virus outbreak suddenly felt right upon us. And then you saw people respond accordingly.
And Susan, Clayton, that makes me think of vulnerability. It's like, oh my gosh, if Tom Hanks can get it, if Private Ryan can get it, what does that mean about a normal person? So talk about the vulnerability and how we assess our different vulnerability to these different threats.
Absolutely, and it's not just Private Ryan; it's Mr. Rogers of all things. Okay, so I think there was that Tom Hanks was not only somebody that everybody recognized, and therefore it became much more real and immediate, but if he could get it, if he, this famous, well-known person could get it, what chance does a normal person like myself have? So absolutely, I think it definitely increased that feeling of vulnerability because you could see it happening to people who you recognized. And then getting back to the health issue I was talking about before, that we do have this um, recognition, probably at some instinctive level, that we're all vulnerable to disease. So we're very we can feel very threatened by it. We like to avoid things that might lead to contamination. And unfortunately, that kind of reaction sometimes underlies a lot of, racist responses, particularly in this case, it's the idea that it's a foreign virus that is invading the American body politic. Is certainly affecting some people's reactions. So that vulnerability to something coming from outside, and something that, in the case of a virus, literally enters your body, is disturbing on a very basic instinctive level.
When people feel vulnerable, they're not necessarily feeling confident. And Peter, you talk about how there's certain ages of confidence when this country has taken on big challenges. So tell us about particularly the 60s and how confident you see confidence as related to our national will to take on big challenges.
Sure. So when confidence is low, the only thing we care about is me here now. And so all of our decision making is in the context of physical, relational, time, geographic proximity. And as confidence rises, it is as if we're wearing variable lens glasses, and suddenly we feel more comfortable in things that are distant from us. And I think that you saw in the 1960s that being expressed not just in terms of things like the space race and the rise of the multinational corporation, but in terms of things like our interest in climate change. I mean, you go back to the first environmental days that were really the focus. It's part of that. We're going to take on enormous challenges, and I think we've seen a similar echo to that very recently in terms of climate change being on the cover of Time magazine, and at the interesting concurrence with things like SpaceX and Blue Origin. We're interested in taking on true transformational activities.
So that says we're feeling confident now. Robert, I want to ask you about whether you agree that sort of we're able to tackle right now big things like climate change. We have a question from Susan Barnett on Facebook. How will this pandemic affect attitudes and policies about the ways in which our country can best proceed to deal with climate change?
I think a lot of the resistance to taking action about climate change is rooted in the fact that it will be very expensive to really make a meaningful dent in the problem. And what this illustrated is that when we need to do something, cost is literally no object. If we must do something, we can do it. We're an incredibly wealthy country. The evidence from the very large and contentious literature on the determinants of human happiness suggests that beyond a certain point, and it's one we've long since passed in this country and in most of the West, further increases in most forms of private consumption don't really have any real impact other than to raise the bar that defines what we feel we need. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal. I lived in a 2-room house with no running water, no electricity. It never felt for a moment inadequate. If I lived in that house here, I'd be dismayed. I wouldn't want people to know where I lived. I'd be ashamed. The context matters enormously. Everybody wants to succeed. Succeeding is just a purely relative construct. To succeed means to do well relative to some norm. And if we needed to come up with literally $2, $3, $4 trillion a year to deal with a threat, we could do that without anybody having to make any enduring sacrifice at all. The level of consumption would grow less quickly or would decline slightly for the people at the top of the ladder, and that would not be any hardship at all for them to adjust to.
Robert, would you be willing to go back now to live in that the conditions you lived in Nepal when you were in your 20s? If that would solve climate, would you do it?
If just by my doing that, if that would solve the climate crisis, of course I would do it.
Would you do it if no one else did it? Or I think about this with flying, because like I feel guilty about flying, and I look around and I see, well, other people are flying. When there's a leader, maybe it's Greta, saying, okay, you know what, flying shame, not going to fly. When I'll be a joiner, not a leader. Am I going to sacrifice first?
We do know that people are more willing to make sacrifices if they see others making sacrifices along with them. Absolutely. If you make a sacrifice and others don't, often you feel like. So yes, that's a clear, important strand of motivation. But still, we see people making unilateral sacrifices all the time. I just read about a 72-year-old Italian priest who was on a ventilator. They're out of ventilators, of course, in the north of Italy, as we will be here if we don't take immediate action. He was on a ventilator. He was not able to survive without one. There was a younger priest from his diocese who entered the hospital and had respiratory distress, needed a ventilator. There were none for him. He voluntarily gave the younger priest his ventilator and died a day or two later. We step back in awe and admiration for that step. Would I have done that? I don't know. I would like to think I might have done that, but who can know unless you're in that situation?
Susan Clayton, have you sacrificed or would you sacrifice for climate?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that there's a big distinction here. If I knew that I myself, by living in a 2-room house in Nepal or in Ohio, would solve the problem of climate change, there is no question in the world I would do it, even if I were the only person who was doing it. But if I thought, if all of us do that, that will solve climate change, and I'm the only one doing it, then I would not want to do it. So it's a combination of individual responsibility and also individual efficacy. You know, what can I accomplish through my individual actions? I think that there are really two important things. One is how strongly we are influenced by the behavior of others, and that includes whether we're likely to make sacrifices on behalf of the others. We're more likely to if we think other people also will. But there are clearly some people who will take these individual actions and not wait to see what other people are doing. And I think that's what, for example, Greta Thunberg did and had such a powerful influence for that reason. She didn't say, gee, I'm just one person, what can I do? Nobody else is doing anything. She just went out and did it. And most of us would not do that. But the fact that she did it has had an enormous impact.
And the people, some of the intellectual thinkers that are behind Greta Thunberg that she based her theory of change on have said that that sacrifice should not be taken calibrated to efficacy. Like the sacrifice has its own moral power, and that's if it's the right thing to do, that not flying, not because she thinks that everyone should live that way or that that it will change flying, but sort of there's an inherent justification because if we all go around thinking that, well, I'll change if I think it'll matter and have an impact, then that's kind of a trap because all of our individual changes are insignificant. So that goes nowhere.
Yeah, it's really, I'm glad you kind of brought ethics into it because absolutely, there are things that people, being a vegetarian, for example, a lot of people are vegetarians not because they think they'll necessarily have an impact, but because they feel very strongly about not harming animals.
Right. And I want to get at this idea, Peter Atwater, about, behavior. Does individual behavior then support policy action, or does individual behavior sometimes soften our support for things that are broader? If I think that, I have an electric car and I'm vegan, then maybe I can be against the carbon tax. So I want to get at that tension between broader policy and individual action.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of my big concerns looking at climate change is that our level of confidence has been quite shaken by the virus. And so, even just a few months ago, you saw this extraordinary energy around climate change that I'm worrying now has been evaporated because we've gone from an us everywhere forever mindset to a me here now mindset. And so rather than trying to undertake transformational change, we're going to find ourselves in a policy environment where we're forced to um, expend energy and a substantial amount of money around remediation, that our attention goes from solving the problem to fixing the consequences of the unsolved problem. And that is sort of what naturally happens in environments of low confidence.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about the invisible threats of COVID-19 and carbon pollution. Why are we responding to the coronavirus more aggressively than climate disruption that is also wreaking global havoc? I'm Greg Dalton. My guests are Peter Atwater, adjunct economics professor at the College of William and Mary, Susan Clayton, professor of psychology at College of Wooster, and Robert Frank is professor of economics at Cornell University's Johnson Graduate School of Management. Robert Frank, in the Great Recession, there in the stimulus package, there was a lot of money for renewable energy, that sort of thing. But then when the economy tanked, all of a sudden that appetite, we can't afford to get off fossil fuels now, it'll cost too much. We are in a recession now. It is going to be bad. Morgan Stanley said this recently. They predicted that could be 13% unemployment, 30% drop in GDP in one quarter. This is bad. It's going to be bad. Does that mean that America's appetite for going green is going to be decimated?
I think when we're in a period of slump, the appetite for spending on all manner of things gets decimated. The social progress that societies have made has most often come during periods of high economic growth rather than low economic growth. And I think that's been an issue in the climate movement. Many people say we've got to learn to live without growth in order to save the climate. But I think that's probably not the right way to frame the issue. What we know is that it's only growth in certain kinds of things that are damaging. And we really do have the policy levers to encourage growth in non-harmful activities and services and restrain growth in the ones that really cause harm, and have overall a healthy rate of economic growth, which we know politically makes it much more likely that societies will spend the money that they need to make real social and economic change with respect to climate or any other goal that we're trying to achieve.
Peter Atwater, you study the markets. The markets are, down big time. Is it going to be years before there's an appetite for making investments in green infrastructure? Some of the bailout plans are offering a lifeline to oil and gas companies to kind of prop up fossil fuels. Gasoline is now tickling $1 a gallon, which means that means the SUV looks viable now.
I mean, they're talking about negative oil prices potentially, which is just hard to wrap our minds around.
Yeah.
But I think that, to the extent that confidence remains low, you're going to see intense energy spent on what are the current problems that need to be addressed today. And so often, and we saw this in 2009, it's about restoring and remedying what exists right now. The mindset is not towards the future, it's entirely towards the present. It's that me here now mindset. And so I do think that, bold climate change policy action is likely to be on the back burner for some time. And depending on the speed of recovery, that could be years, if not decades.
Right. We have a question from Sean Adderley on YouTube. Will the COVID-19 pandemic lead to more people working remotely permanently? That ends up reducing pollution by eliminating commuting. So perhaps there could be some behavioral changes here, Susan Clayton, that might stick and reduce carbon impacts.
Absolutely. And I wanted to take a bit more optimistic viewpoint, partly because that's something I just try to do in general. That one thing that happens in times of a recession is usually that carbon emissions drop dramatically. And so I think that there will be there's already going to be probably some immediate benefits there. And in the slightly longer term, people will get used to doing things differently. I think when you have this we're at kind of a transition point, and so it will encourage people to rethink some things that they might not be willing to rethink if the economy was just purring along the way it had been. And that one in particular, I think, I'm guessing, but so many people have had to get used to virtual meetings, virtual business meetings, virtual travel. I think a lot of that will stick, and it might help a lot of business practices to become more efficient in that way.
Peter Atwater, you write about how, or talk about how there's episodes of repetition. If this is viewed as a one-time random thing and it goes away and we get through it, that's different than something that repeats like a hurricane after hurricane after hurricane. So how do you think about how much this behavioral and social change from this COVID crisis will stick?
So I think the lasting unknown question today is, as we handle this crisis, have people been traumatized by this? That perception that it could happen again. There's a lot of discussion that we will need a vaccine in order for the population to calm down about the potential risk of another pandemic sometime soon. So I think that vulnerability here with respect to the outbreak is going to be very important. Do we look at this as a one-time event, in which case we'll treat it as a shock, or is there some lingering sense that it could happen again? And there the impact, could be quite profound, from, people changing their consumption habits in terms of, how much do you stockpile in your pantry? What are our expectations for businesses, for supermarkets, in terms of what is kept on the shelves? So there's the potential for profound change as we consider where we were vulnerable coming into this crisis.
There's a tweet I saw recently by Joshua Grubb, who's a psychology professor, and this is from him on Twitter. This is millennials. Welcome to your teenage years. Here's a global terrorism event to define your adolescence. Welcome to adulthood. Here's a global recession. Welcome to parenthood. Here's a global pandemic. I'm terrified of what middle age will bring. Peter Atwater, there's been a crisis, major crisis, every 10 years, from the dot-com boom, 9/11, to the Great Recession, to now. That's a lot for people to take in. And what does that mean in terms of, we seem to having more frequent big crises?
Yeah, I think it changes people's mindset to, living for the present. At the same time, you have that sense of vulnerability where I think you're going to see corporations, particularly, being forced to reassess the balance between profitability and true humanity sustainability. What are we going to expect corporations to do differently on the other side of this to mitigate those risks? Same expectations with respect to government.
Susan Clayton, I'd like to talk about blame. There's some blame about, could the U.S. have done better? Obviously, it's been slow to respond. That's backward looking. What's the role of blame now, where we're in this crisis, whether it's who's to blame for climate change or who's to blame for the slow U.S. response?
Yeah, blame is a really common reaction. We all do it. I mean, if I stub my toe, I want to find somebody to blame for that. I don't want to take personal responsibility for that. So we want to blame another country for the virus, or we want to blame bad government policies. We want to blame other people for climate change, for not doing anything in response. So I'm not upset. I don't get mad at people for this blame game, but we have to move beyond it, because it does have implications for actions. If we blame, other people or big businesses for climate change, then we don't take on individual responsibility for doing anything about it. If we blame, another country for the coronavirus, we might not think about policies that, our country could implement that could protect us or do a better job of taking care of us.
Robert Frank, we're seeing, a stress on one system right now, healthcare system, financial system. But think about climate change. Scientists tell us there could be multiple cascading system stresses and failures, food, water, et cetera. So, how do you think about that and what the economic implications of what we're seeing right now as a big stress and, add on floods in the Midwest this winter? These things could really cascade.
Yeah, and I think the fact of all of those threats being so vivid and so visible now, really, you have to think about that as a possible opportunity. Very, very seldom does any really big change occur except in the wake of some sort of crisis or another. The Great Depression, for example, was not solved by the programs that FDR adopted, the WPA, the CCC. Those helped, but we didn't really get out of the Great Depression until the massive mobilization that we undertook during World War II. And I think once we're in the midst of the downturn that's coming in the wake of this coronavirus disruption, we're going to be in a depression that may even be much more serious and long-lasting in threat, at least, than the one we faced in the Great Depression. And that's really an opportunity to mobilize, to undertake the kind of public investments that we really need to take if we're to have any realistic hope of parrying the climate threat. The good news is that there are things we can do that would actually hold warming to an acceptable level. It's going to be difficult. It's going to require a mobilization on the scale that we did during World War II, but we did that. We got through that. People were not unhappy because they were pulling hard for an objective during those years. And so creating jobs to undertake the green investment, that's going to be a way forward out of this coming recession. And I think if we stay focused, we can really make a good outcome out of this rather than an enduring bad one.
I interview lots of people who say that technology exists, we have the tools, we just need to use them. But Peter Atwater, what I've seen, is lacking that political social will. Maybe that's going to be somehow flower out of this, because after we spend $1 trillion, another trillion doesn't seem so much.
So I think you'll see policymakers following that mood. They're in the business of reacting. We wish they would lead, but more times than not, history shows that they're responding to the populist cries, the population cries. And so I think that what we are likely to see in this is leaders who are rising to the fore. I think we're seeing some of this already, where problems are being localized. And so you're seeing local community level leaders, city leaders, state leaders, who are really coming into their own. And I think that the response to crisis, that the bottoming in crisis in terms of confidence, always begins at a very small local level. And so I think what we're likely to see in the next months and years are communities determining where they go from here. And I think it's a period of social entrepreneurship.
Robert Frank, particularly, what are some of the individual leaders that you see? Obviously, America's mayor, Rudy Giuliani, came out of the ashes of 9/11 and had national prominence. A lot of politicians are campaigning, are auditioning for president now. Who do you see that is really rising in this moment of crisis?
Well, I live in New York, and New York is, as you know, the epicenter of the virus outbreak. We have 10 times as many cases as California does at the moment. It's not clear how quickly the social distancing measures that we've adopted will slow the rate of growth of it. But I have been, for the past days, watching the news briefings given by Andrew Cuomo, our governor. I was not until recently a fan of his. I have become probably as big a fan of his as I've ever been of any politician. He has been absolutely masterful in his command of the details of what needs to happen on the ground and is taking the steps to mobilize people to do the things that need to be done so incredibly effectively that I think if we had more leadership of that sort, we would get through this much more quickly. But yeah, he's one example. I think Jay Inslee in Washington State has been an early leader that's taken charge of what needs to be done locally and seen great progress. Your own governor in California is now acting very vigorously on this issue. So yeah, there's lots of good examples out there.
Susan Clayton, your views on people showing leadership now at this time of crisis?
Yeah, well, a lot of people, I had a sort of similar reaction to Ohio's governor, Mike DeWine. I don't agree with a lot of his political stances, but he's been out in front on this, and he's insisted from the beginning that we need to look at the science and do what the science tells us to do and take actions as needed to confine the virus. And he's gotten a lot of support for his actions, so that's been good to see. I think that more generally, we have seen such a range of responses, and hopefully that will give people the message that there are things that leaders can do that make a difference. Because I think we're a very individualistic country, and we don't like to be told what to do, and we like to go our own way. And there's a lot of places where there's not much support for central government. But I think that, and by central, it could be a city government, but government as opposed to individual. I think this is a case where many people are recognizing that you do need to have government help, government advice, government regulations to really get through this.
Peter Atwater, you write that social media kind of mirrors us, and we just heard Susan say that I don't agree with Mike DeWine, but he's been a leader on many issues. He's been a leader here. Could this be a time of coming together? Are we seeing empathy on social media, which has so divided us?
So I think you're seeing a lot of a dramatic change in what it means to be a leader today. And so these are the environments where resilience, empathy, authenticity, reality are critical elements of what it means to be a leader in crisis. And so I think you're already starting to see changes in where people are going for those messages. I think it's likely to have a major impact in terms of where we're getting our news, how we're dealing with social media. I think there is an intense desire to understand, and I think there's a real questioning in terms of what is true in this environment. I think we've lived through the fake news environment, and now it's going to be a question of where is the truth, and for an invisible threat, that is critical.
But Robert, Frank, the purveyors of fake news love chaos, and there's lots of people out there fishing and trying to exploit people right now, in using their best judgment, right? So aren't we vulnerable right now because we're so afraid? And does that bring up our better selves or our more protective, selfish selves?
I think it is good to be leery of those kinds of moves. We know they were quite prevalent during the 2016 election. We're seeing them again now in individual campaigns. But I think people are pretty good judges of character in the long run. And the qualities that Peter mentioned in a leader are not qualities that are easy to fake. If you are in command of a situation, if you're sleeping 4 hours a night and you're working with people intensively to get things done, you can pretend to be that kind of a leader for a little while, but it doesn't hold up for very long. I think the public in the end will make pretty sound judgments about who to listen to and who not to.
Robert, Frank, you write about trust in your book, and when people tip when they don't have to, or pay taxes when they won't get caught. I'm interested in how trust is being, built or damaged right now when people are unsure of. Some people are coming together and taking time to connect with people they haven't connected with because they're so busy, and there's also a little bit of distrust. Susan mentioned some of the racial tension. We're afraid now. Does that make us trust more or trust less?
I think I do see this as a time of coming together. On balance, there are forces in the other direction too, but on balance, I do think it will be one of coming together. And I think the issue of trying to do what's best for the community, even though it might not be the most expeditious thing for you to do, is what's going to separate people. If you have something you'd like to do, but you don't do it because you think it would expose people to more risk, most of the people you will have helped by restraining your urge to do what was in your interest won't know that you did it. It's like leaving a tip when you're on the road. You won't come back and benefit from good service the next time because you're not going to come back. So why should you leave a tip in that situation? Well, you shouldn't leave a tip hoping to benefit, of course, that's not the motive, but the kind of person who takes that kind of action, who denies himself or herself a benefit for the benefit of the community, in the process of doing that, you become a different kind of person. I mean, we're not born in the world with fixed identities. We become who we are through repeated action. So you become a better person when you do those sorts of things. And here's the key step. Other people have insight into the kind of person you are. If you're the kind of person who would tip on the road when no one was looking, people who know you probably know that about you, even though they can't have had an opportunity to see that about you. And if people regard you as that kind of a person, that's very much in your interest. So I think that shouldn't be your reason for doing the right thing when no one's looking, but it surely wouldn't hurt people to know that doing the right thing when no one's looking changes the kind of person you are in a way that makes others more likely to pick you as a member they want to be on their team.
Susan Clayton, are people conscious of that sort of thing? That, well, you're right, I'm doing the right thing by distancing, and some person I don't know I'm benefiting, and that somehow am I aware of that virtue, or is that more subconscious?
Oh, I think some of us are. I think most people, at least some of the time, are trying to be good people. Now we can, engage in a lot of rationalization about how it's consistent with my being a good person to nevertheless do something that maybe is not so good. But to the extent that we're thinking about it, I think if we really believe that we will be harming others by coming too close, then we'll be trying not to do that. One thing I've particularly been seeing a lot, and I live in a fairly small community, but I've been seeing a lot of community cohesion. So I think I want to echo that idea that people are coming together. A lot of emphasis on supporting the local businesses and the local restaurants, and promising to go there more often when they open again, and people posting that they have some young adult children who are home from college maybe with nothing to do, and they can run errands for people who might need something. So I think this kind of atmosphere does encourage that kind of coming together, as we recognize our dependence on each other, much as we might not want to recognize it. I think we are confronted with that. And I just wanted to get back to the issue of a sort of fake truths. I think, one kind of difference between the coronavirus and climate change has to do with that extent to which climate change has been successfully polarized, so that, people believe different things depending on what group they're in. There have been some attempts to do that with the coronavirus, but those attempts have been less successful. So it's less divisive, I think, than climate change is.
Nice to have one of those. Jennifer Rubin is a conservative columnist for the Washington Post, and she writes today about consequences for bad actors, noting that there are legal precedents where people sue a friend or relative because they got a communicable disease, raising the question. She's talking about, mentions Senator Rand Paul, who was exposed to the virus and then was around other U.S. senators, and because of that, some senators are sequestered and unable to vote. It's really affecting our national politics right now. Peter Atwater, your thoughts on consequences for bad actors, behavioral punishment. Right now, it's all on our identity and our own conscience. There's no real cost to avoiding a stay in place or shelter at home order.
So I think you're going to see, if mood stays low and we start to see the formation of clear social norms around what was acceptable, what is acceptable, that you'll see substantial penalties and punishments for those that don't fall in line with the social norms that develop. I think it's interesting that we're already seeing bipartisan focus around consequences to hoarders and people who have selfishly taken medical equipment that could have been better used by others, those who are scalping products online. And so I think that you're going to see a clear social establishment of what it means to be good and bad in this environment, and that would be social norms are critical to the extent that they both foster and reflect confidence.
Robert Frank, your thoughts on punishment, whether it's economic consequences or costs or others, and there's also incentives. Taiwan, I think, paid people to stay at home, right? There was a carrot and a stick.
My early work, I focused largely on the fact that decent behavior, trustworthy behavior could evolve even when there weren't any rules or penalties for not behaving well. And I think that's still true, but I've come in the process of studying behavioral contagion to think that the rules and the enforcement of the rules are much more important than that early work suggested. I think a really nice example of where we've stepped astray is starting in 2011, we've been cutting the enforcement budget of the IRS steadily. It's now much, much less likely, especially if you're a wealthy individual or a large corporation, you're much less likely to be audited now than before. And as a consequence of that, I think people are just beginning to get the perception that if you cheat, you're not likely to be caught and punished for it. And in fact, the punishments are often quite mild, even if you are caught, but you're not likely to be caught. And that's a critical threshold. Once people sense that others are cheating and getting away with it and benefiting, and you're not, then you feel like you're being a total chump, and you become much, much more likely to cheat yourself. And then we see a one-away contagion of cheating, and the last thing we need is to see that happen. So I think, yes, you should be good because it's the right thing to do. Yes, you should take heart because if you're good, others will somehow sense that you're that kind of person and be more likely to choose you. But we also need rules that punish you if you're not good.
We're talking about the COVID-19 and carbon pollution at Climate One. I'm Greg Dalton. My guests are Susan Clayton, Peter Atwater, and Robert Frank. All of you being in academia, we have a question from Marcus on YouTube. Will the virus epidemic mobilize youth regarding climate activism? So what are you seeing from your students? You're not seeing them now because you're not in classrooms with them. Susan Frank. I'm sorry, Susan Clayton.
Yeah, well, I'm not seeing them. And I don't know. I mean, one thing that needs to happen for people to take action is to have the opportunities, I think, to act together. Certainly some individuals will take action by themselves, but for the most part, we really need people to come together in social groups. So right now, while everybody's isolated, I don't think we're going to get that kind of momentum. I'm hoping that that it may be a result in the medium term of this kind of crisis that the students and the young adults recognize that some drastic changes are needed. I think that this crisis may shock us out of our complacency and out of recognize that we need to shake up the status quo a little bit.
Robert Frank, is this going to ignite people in a way?
Well, it's the young people who've really seized this issue as their own. The Sunrise Movement, Greta Thunberg. Greta Thunberg must have hoped that her nascent crusade would make a difference when she started out. I've got a great picture of her at age 14, huddled against a school building wall with a sign about her rally that nobody attended. She can't possibly have expected that it would lead to what actually did happen in the wake of her efforts. And that's the thing. The behaviors in this domain and many others are contagious. That means if you take an action, other people may see you take it or may be inspired by your having taken it, and that will influence them to act. And it may fizzle quickly thereafter, but it might not. They might act in a way that influences somebody else, and then it might explode in exactly the way that we've seen her crusade explode. And so I think the whole idea that if you take what seems like a small, insignificant action, yes, the direct effect of that is probably going to be insignificant. The world will be the same one way as if you hadn't taken it. But the fact is, it might not. And we know that in many domains, if you put solar panels on your roof early in the cycle, 4 months later, somebody else is moved by your having done that to do it. And then 4 months after that, you've got 4 panels. Another 4 months pass, you've got 8. And after just 2 years, you got 32 panels on the rooftops, just because you made the first move at time 0. So yeah, the individual actions that people take can be enormously consequential, much more than people realize.
Right. You write about, the strong impulse to mimic. I think you write about like this, how we try to mimic the people, whether it's clothes, behaviors, how powerful and deep that is in us.
Yes. I think seeing people do the right thing is especially powerful as an impulse to get you moving down that same path. It's
makes our absence of leadership right now, national leadership, all the more painful. Peter Atwater, your thoughts on whether, youth, because COVID-19 is sucking all our mental energy. There's no time. Joe Biden's like out there somewhere trying to run for president. Can climate kind of sprout from this, and will it ignite your students?
So what I'm watching really closely is how does this overwhelming sense of vulnerability that these young people have been feeling already. The anxiety level on college campuses is something that, has gotten a lot of attention. And so there's a sense of vulnerability that young people are sensing. And so I'm really curious to see, what do they do? Is it aimed at climate change? Is it aimed more broadly in terms of corporations and governments? But I expect that coming out of this, we are going to see young people who have said, you, the adults, have failed to provide certainty and control to the world around us. Therefore, it's up to us to now do that. And so I'm very excited by where they start to take things.
And you write, Peter, you talk about how anxiety searches peak in the middle of the night, and anxiety makes it hard for people to learn. When we're so anxious right now, how can we learn and how we can decide that future?
Yeah, I think we forget that confidence is all cognitive. And so we have a tremendous amount of bandwidth, all of us right now, that is being exhausted by this unknown, unseeable virus. And so trying to teach students, trying to learn in this environment is very difficult. And I think all of us need to appreciate the challenge of going on with our lives in a routine way amidst a confidence hurricane, as it were.
Well, as we wrap up, I want to ask each of you kind of how you're personally dealing with, this anxiety of isolation, knowing what you know about climate, knowing what you know about COVID. Susan, Frank, how are you kind of keeping your feet on the ground, keeping it together in this time of high anxiety?
Yeah, well, I wish I could say that I was coping ideally, but just little things. It's important, I think, to keep to a routine. It's important. So far, I've managed to get dressed every day, even though I'm not seeing anybody. To make sure you get exercise, give yourself some stress-free things to do. Just the same things that we do to cope with anxiety under other circumstances, but especially to find ways to keep those social connections going when you have to work a little bit harder at them than you do under normal circumstances.
Does binge watching something on streaming, does that make the anxiety go away, or does it just hide it for a little while?
It can help, honestly. There's some anxieties that need to be faced and that you can, that avoiding just postpones them. But since there's not that much we can do about this right now, there's nothing wrong with just taking your mind off it for a few hours and binging something.
Robert Frank, how you coping?
Well, I'm in quarantine, more or less, self-quarantine. I was in London giving book talks last week. Probably shouldn't have gone, but it was before they were telling us not to go. The moment I landed in London, I read news that the epidemiologists had wanted to tell people in my age bracket not to fly on long flights. I had just been on one. They had been overruled by the president against giving that advice. So I had to fly back. And on the flight back, with the travel ban kicking in, I was on an absolutely full flight. There were 2 sick people next to me. I was in the middle seat. And so I've been sitting here for the last week, hoping I don't get sick. So far I haven't, I guess, with each day, it seems. But also feeling guilty and trying to think of ways to help. I mean, I'm in a profession where I don't lose any income as a result of any of the moves that have been instituted to shut the economy down. I've got ample resources. What can I do to make life a little less unlucky situation?
Yeah, I think the research shows helping other people may be one thing that can guaranteed to make you feel good. Peter Atwater, how are you coping? Final word.
So I spend a lot of time talking about confidence, and particularly talking about environments of underconfidence, which is what this is all about. And so to cope, it's not only reminding others, but reminding myself that these environments tend to be short-lived but intense. We've all been in environments where we were powerless and uncertain before. So to be able to say, yes, this will pass, been here before, and to not underestimate resilience. We really doubt our ability in moments like this, and to temper our mean voices. I'm certainly trying to do that to myself, that these are moments that are difficult, but we will get through them.
But I tend to think of the viral video of the Italians on their balcony singing opera together, right? That's such a beautiful human moment, and thank the Italians for showing us how to find joy and beauty in a very dark time, more in their country more than ours. On Climate One today, we've been talking about how humans process the threats of 2 invisible threats, COVID-19 virus and carbon pollution. We've been discussing the emotional and economic reactions and learned how massive change is possible when people are motivated in certain parts of their brains. I'm Greg Dalton, and my guests on Climate One today were Peter Atwater, adjunct economics professor at College of William and Mary. He studies confidence-driven decision-making and trends in financial markets in his Financial Insights newsletter. Susan Clayton, professor of psychology at College of Wooster. Am I saying that right? Wooster? Where she also is chair of environmental studies. She co-authored the American Psychological Association report, Psychology and Global Climate Change. Robert Frank is professor of economics at Cornell University's Johnson Graduate School of Management, former columnist for the New York Times and author of Under the Influence, Putting Peer Pressure to Work. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your pods. Please subscribe, rate, review. Thanks to you people joining us on video, Facebook, and YouTube. And we'll see you next time, everybody. Thanks a lot.